Let us start the first module with the background of the story. This story is written keeping the First World War in view. That is, it occurs during the time after the First World War had taken place. And this story takes place on a cruise, on a liner, that is on a ship, which is actually traveling from San Francisco to Yokohama, Japan. Now, this is a time one must keep in mind. It's a time where there is a lot of animosity in the air. There is a lot of anger and hatred between the races in the air. But yet, since this story takes place on a ship, it represents the whole world because a lot of people from different parts of the world are traveling in this ship. Somerset Maugham has set this story around this for two reasons, and that is very important for us to understand before we really move ahead with the story. First is, there are three characters that we must keep in mind when we are going through the story. The first is a narrator whose name we don't know at all. The second person is Mr. Kellada, who is of an Oriental origin, but then he is a British citizen. And then there is another gentleman called Mr. Ramsay. Now, these three people are from different regions, and there is a lot of tension in the air when the story is narrated by the narrator. The narrator does not like Mr. Kellada at all. Even before he meets him, he doesn't like. Why does he not like? First of all, he does not like the name Kellada. He says in the beginning of the stories that he would have been more comfortable if the person whom he is sharing his cabin with was Mr. Brown or Mr. Smith. But then it turns out to be Mr. Kellada. So, the animosity starts at the very beginning, even before he meets the man. And the other thing that is very important is, as I have already told you before, when there is a war going on and when there is a lot of tension, then naturally people don't look at each other in a friendly way. So, these two things you keep in mind when we go ahead with our story. First is, the narrator, who is a Britisher, does not like a stranger who belongs to an Oriental origin. He is traveling in a ship, and this narrator has to share a cabin with a total stranger. And this narrator feels that he would be more comfortable if that stranger was a European and preferably a Britisher. So, now that you have these things in mind, let us now move ahead with the story. Let us start with the next module. Born in Paris of Irish ancestry, Somerset Maugham wrote short evocative stories that really touched the minds of people who read them. They were often set in the more obscure and remote areas of the British Empire. He studied in London and eventually qualified as a surgeon at St. James Thomas Hospital. He conducted his year's medical practice in the slums of East End, and that is where he found material for his books. His first novel that he wrote was Lisa of Lambeth, which was published in the year 1897, and much of the material for his critically acclaimed autobiographical novel called Of Human Bondage. He moved to Paris, where he struck a successful working relationship with Lawrence Houseman and wrote a number of plays that would be run in London from 1908. Continuing with his travels, Maugham took to South Seas, where he visited the island of Tahiti and on which he based his novel The Moon and Sixpence. Sickness forced Maugham to return and remain in Scottish country in a tuberculosis sanatorium. However, on recovery, he returned to the Far East, and there he wrote a number of plays and novels. A few of them are East of Suez in 1922, Our Betters in 1923, The Letter in 1927. These are amongst his better known books. Returning to settle in France in the year 1928, he wrote what many regard as his satirical masterpiece called Cakes and Ale, a literary biography within a novel that examined the private sin that accomplishes public success. From early January 1938 until the end of March 1938, Maugham travelled to India, where he met the spiritual Indian holy man Sri Ramana Maharishi and was inspired to write his most famous novel, The Razor's Edge. Now, let us go ahead and read this short story written by Somerset Maugham called Mr. Know-All. The short story Mr. Know-All, written by Somerset Maugham, is actually in a first person narration. The narrator is a person who is telling the story to us. We do not know the name of the narrator at all as we read through the story, not even at the end. The narrator plays a major as well as a minor part in the story. Now, how does he play a major part and how does he play a minor part? Let me explain to you. The main protagonist of the story or the main person of the story is Mr. Kellada, who is also known as Mr. Know-All. The narrator is a major character because we understand Mr. Kellada through the narrator's point of view. It is the narrator who is actually telling us about Mr. Kellada. He is creating an impression about Mr. Kellada in our minds. So, in that way, he is playing a key role. He is trying to mold our minds. He is trying to give his point of view so that we understand Kellada the way he wants us to understand. So, in that way, we can say he is a major character. The other point of view, he is a minor character because he is not really involved in the story. He is just a person who is observing what is happening in the ship and how is Mr. Kellada behaving. Of course, he is a man who is sharing the cabin with Mr. Kellada on the cruise, no doubt. But then the whole story revolves around Mr. Kellada. So, in that sense, he plays a very minor role. So, now it is entirely up to us, the readers, to ascertain whether he is a major or a minor character. Now, the narrator tells about the good as well as the bad of Mr. Kellada to us. First of all, as I told you earlier in the first module itself, that the narrator did not like Mr. Kellada at all. The narrator is an English snob. He is a Britisher and he has sympathy for his own countrymen. He likes his own countrymen. And as I was telling you that this entire story takes place on a ship. They are moving from America to Japan, San Francisco to Yokohama, Japan. So, in their travel, they are meeting lots and lots of people. And especially during the time of war, it is very difficult to get a cabin, a place on the ship because the liners were totally jam packed and people were, there was a lot of movement on the ocean at that point of time. So, he had no other choice but to adjust with this man called Mr. Kellada. So, he enters the cabin and he is very disappointed that as it is, he is sharing this cabin with a man called Mr. Kellada, who is according to him not a Britisher. As soon as he enters, he sees an array of suitcases and toiletries and huge suitcases with big labels on them. He starts disliking him even more because those suitcases, talk about ostentatiousness, they talk about flamboyance, they talk about Mr. Kellada, who appears to be quite wealthy, who appears to be very rich. When you look at the luggage, you know that yes, this man is rich. So, he does not really meet Mr. Kellada, but as soon as he enters the cabin, he sees all that luggage and he does not like him even more. So, there is already a kind of antagonism that he is he has in his heart and in his mind against Mr. Kelada. From there he goes on to the deck to have drinks, and Mr. Kelada comes and greets him. He doesn't even use his first, he doesn't even call him Mr. or he doesn't talk to him formally, but he just goes and starts talking to the narrator as if he knows him for a very long time. This makes the narrator even more angry with Mr. Kelada. So there is a lot of hatred, there is a lot of ill will that he has towards him. Mr. Kelada, on the other hand, is a very pompous man, a man who loves to show off, a man who loves to talk, a man who is argumentative, who always wishes to win an argument, who is not at all silent when he is eating his lunch or dinner, who is extremely talkative and who knows about everything in the world, who knows about any person on the ship, and in no time everybody on the ship knows Mr. Kelada and he knows everybody. And sometimes people very jeeringly start calling him Mr. Know-all, because here was this one man who really said he knew everything. You start a topic, Mr. Kelada would say, I know about that topic. You talk about a particular thing, he would say he knew about that thing. So there was nothing that Mr. Kelada did not know. And if there was a discussion, that would definitely lead into an argument, and Mr. Kelada had to win that argument. So everybody on the ship started calling him Mr. Know-all. And obviously the narrator, who is a typical Britisher, who is very quiet, who believes in manners, who thinks that good behavior is the right thing that a good gentleman should have, a person should not talk while he is eating, a person should not be pushy. Mr. Kelada is extremely pushy. So obviously he does not really like him at all. But then as the story progresses, you realize that appearances are deceptive. You should never judge the book by the cover. Mr. Kelada may appear to be very pompous, may appear to be very arrogant, may appear to be very talkative, may appear to be very flamboyant, but then he was a very good man, and that is what we will learn as the story unfolds. Let us now learn what happens further in the next module. Now, on the ship, of course, it is not possible for just two people to have dinners. A lot of people sitting and eating dinner together or lunch together. So, in that group of theirs, there was a man called Mr. Ramsay, R-A-M-S-A-Y. He was an American consular serviceman who was actually posted in Kobe, an island near Japan. He was actually bringing his wife back from New York, and they were traveling to Kobe. Now, his wife was alone in America for almost a year, and he was stationed in Kobe and he was working there. So, he had gone back to America and he had brought along his wife, and so he and his wife, Mr. Kelada, the narrator, and another doctor, they would all sit together for dinner and they would have their dinners and lunches together. This Mr. Ramsay was also very argumentative. He was very dogmatic. He also did not like Mr. Kelada. The others suffered Mr. Kelada. I mean, they never really said anything to him. But then Mr. Ramsay would get into an argument with Mr. Kelada, and obviously Kelada would always, see that he would win those arguments. He was very pushy by his very nature. So one day when they were all sitting around the dinner table, Mrs. Ramsay was wearing a pearl necklace. Now, Mr. Kelada said that he would bet $100 that Mrs. Ramsay was wearing pearls that were original. Now, I must tell you something about Mrs. Ramsay also. She was a beautiful lady who wore good clothes, appeared very dignified. She was very modest, she was very sweet, and she was very, very lovely to look at. So, and as I was telling you, one day she was wearing this pearl necklace, and Kelada as usual said that Mrs. Ramsay was wearing a very beautiful pearl necklace, and that was original pearls, and he would bet $100 that they were the best pearls. Mr. Ramsay started laughing and said, of course not, that they are not original pearls. In fact, his wife had gone to the department store and had bought that string of pearls for $18. Now, Kelada got really excited about that, and he said he was doing pearl business and he was going to Yokohama for that very reason, and he is one man who knows everything about pearls, real pearls and cultured pearls and so on and so forth. And he decided to tell him that he would examine the pearl string, and he requests Mrs. Ramsay to give him the pearl string. And Mrs. Ramsay says that she is unable to undo the clasp, but Mr. Ramsay asks her to take out, because he wants Kelada to really look into the pearls and really know that actually they are only worth $18. But Mrs. Ramsay says that the clasp isn't opening and so on and so forth. But then eventually she does give him the pearls. Mr. Kelada takes out a magnifying glass, holds the pearl under his eyes, and he is about to examine them when he sees Mrs. Ramsay's expression. She does not want Mr. Kelada to reveal the fact that these pearls are original. She has a desperate look on her face, and she requests silently to Mr. Kelada not to reveal the secret that these pearls are real. In fact, these pearls were given to Mrs. Ramsay by her lover, and they were original pearls. Now, Kelada was a very sensitive man, and that is where his true nature comes out. He realizes that Mrs. Ramsay could not really afford good pearls, but then these pearls must have been given to her by someone. And when she has that appealing look on her face, he realizes that perhaps these pearls were given to her by her lover. So he very calmly says that he has lost the bet, and he accepts that those pearls were not real and that they were cultured pearls, and he takes out a $100 bill and gives it to Mr. Ramsay. Just imagine what would have happened in the ship once they all came to know that Kelada had lost the bet. It went around like wildfire. People started talking that Kelada had lost the bet, Kelada had lost the bet. Once they were back in their cabin, Mr. Kelada and the narrator, Mr. Know-all and the narrator, as they were relaxing, there was an envelope that was pushed under the door. When Mr. Kelada opened, he found the $100 bill. He quietly put the money in his pocket and asked the narrator to tear and throw away the envelope. What have you learnt in this lesson? Let us try to analyze it in the next module. The story teaches us that first impressions are always misleading, and that first impressions are quite deceptive. All that we see is not always gold, or all that glitters is always not gold. We should never judge a book by its cover. I am sure you have heard these proverbs, yes or no? The same thing is applicable to this story also. What was the first impression that you got when I was telling you about Mr. Kelada? What is the first impression that I got when I was reading about Mr. Kelada? The narrator's impression is what is our first impression. The narrator does not like him because he is a Britisher. The narrator does not like his name because he comes from an Oriental background. The narrator does not like his luggage because it is very flamboyant. The narrator doesn't like Mr. Kelada at all because he is very talkative, very pompous, very dogmatic, very argumentative, and we are somehow sucked into the subjective attitude of this narrator, and we also start believing in what the narrator has to say. But as the story progresses, towards the very end, we realize that actually Kelada is a wonderful human being. He is a very good man. He is one person who would do anything. He keeps his own self-respect at stake. He loses a bet knowing that the pearls were real, and he saves a marriage. So appearances are deceptive. On the other hand, how does Mrs. Ramsay appear to us? Very modest, very dignified, very beautifully dressed, very quiet, but then she has been cheating on her husband. So looks are always deceptive, and the first impressions are always not the correct impressions. We must know the people more. Let us move ahead. Now the story basically has two plots. The first plot is the story that takes place between the narrator and Mr. Kellada. And the second plot is between Mr. Kellada and Ramsay. So the first plot is actually full of tension between the two characters. Of course, not from Mr. Kellada's point of view, but definitely from the narrator's point of view. So the second plot actually resolves these tensions. How does it resolve? The first plot, what do we understand in the first plot? The narrator does not like Mr. Kellada. And the second plot, what happens when Mr. Kellada is sitting with Mr. Ramsay? He goes through the pearls and then he tells him that yes, the pearls are not real, they are cultured pearls. He loses the bet and he gives the $100 note. Yes or no? So the second plot actually resolves a lot of tensions of the first plot. The moment the narrator realizes that Mr. Kellada has done something good for Mrs. Ramsay, he has actually saved her marriage, his impression of Mr. Kellada undergoes a sea change. He starts liking Mr. Kellada. He starts appreciating Mr. Kellada. He realizes that appearances are very deceptive. He realizes that Mr. Kellada, though is a very pompous man, a very talkative man, but he is genuinely a very good person. So these are the two plots. The second thing is, what kind of narration is happening here? It is subjective as well as objective. Most of the time, of course, it is subjective. The first part is very subjective because the narrator's impressions, the narrator's emotions, the narrator's anger, the narrator's hatred, the narrator's dislike towards Mr. Kellada pours out, especially when he meets him, when he talks to him, when he sees his luggage in the cabin. So that is very, very subjective. But the discussion between Mr. Ramsay and Mr. Kellada, when that discussion takes place on pearls, at that point of time, the narrator is very quiet. He is just an observer. He is only looking at what is happening there. So there he is not really very subjective. He is just observing what is happening. And then the last part again, when the entire tension is resolved, when he comes to know that Kellada had actually saved Mrs. Ramsay's marriage, that time again the narration becomes subjective. So this is what the story is. I hope you have understood the basic gist of the story. Okay, what is the moral of the story then? Never judge a person by their appearances. In your own life, in your own class, amongst your own classmates, I am sure you must have come across such people. People who are very talkative, who really have a lot of friends, but then there are also silent people who are very friendly and very helpful. So those people eventually get a lot of friends when compared to the people who are very talkative and who try to show off. But then people who talk a lot, it is not necessary that they are showing off. They can also be very good friends. So we do come across different types of people in our lives. So we should learn to respect each and every person that we come across. This is what the story tries to teach us. Mom had a very unique style of narrating stories. He looked at people around. He made stories from the situations and the people that he saw around him. He really touched the hearts and minds of the people. He based his characters on the people that he saw in his everyday life. He had a unique style, and he was excellent in narrating that. He told excellent stories, and he told stories that had relevance, that had a moral. I hope this lesson has really taught you something. Please go through this lesson carefully. Please go through the modules carefully. I have given you a quiz. I have asked you questions. I have asked you a lot of other things. I have given you links and references too. Please go through this lesson. Learn something from this lesson. Try to improve your life. Every lesson that you have in your course has a moral to it. Literature does that. It changes us. It makes us to sit back and think what is right and what is wrong. This lesson also teaches us to judge the right and the wrong. So I hope you have a wonderful day ahead, and I hope you have a wonderful year ahead. Thank you very much.